All right, good morning, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. We so appreciate you being with us this morning for this Post-Secondary Pathways webinar conversation on completion in the age of COVID-19. We are really excited for the conversation, mainly because we have three wonderful guests joining us today. We've got Dr. Brian Bridges, the Secretary of Higher Education in New Jersey. Congratulations on your recent confirmation, Brian. We've also got Antoinette Flores from the Center for American Progress. And we've got Dr. Tim Renick from Georgia State University. Before we jump into the conversation, I'm going to turn things over to the Hunt Institute's President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, for some opening remarks. Over to you, Javed.
Thanks, James. I appreciate everybody taking time to tune in for this conversation with this latest installment of Post-Secondary Pathways. That's featuring leading advocates, practitioners, and students who discuss some of the most pressing higher education issues. The resource experts joining us today are going to approach this topic in two ways. First, by taking stock of the efforts to support students throughout the last 10 months or so. Where did institutions, the states, and the federal government step up to help students in unique ways? What can we take away from this period? We're also excited to hear our panelists talk about what the future of supporting student completion might look like. Many of the flexible course delivery options and remote student services are here to stay, and that should certainly change how policymakers think about ways we are supporting students, and will continue to support students. So we have, as James mentioned, we have an amazing lineup today, and so thank you for all of you to taking time to be with us. James, I'm going to kick it to you to get our conversation started.
Wonderful. Thanks, Javed. Before we jump in, I have a couple of super brief housekeeping notes to share. One is that we have carved out time at the end for audience Q&A, and we're very much looking forward to your questions. However, we do ask that you submit them using the Q&A feature on the Zoom app, which should be at the bottom of your screen. Please note that we're not going to be unmuting lines at any point or calling on people who use the raise hand feature. So we do ask that you use that Q&A in the Zoom app. Another option is to follow the conversation on Twitter. If you do so, please use the hashtag postpathways, and please feel free to submit questions via Twitter as well. I also want to note that we are live streaming on Facebook. And the very last thing to mention is that closed captioning services are available for this webinar, and there's a closed captions button that should also be towards the bottom of your screen. Now that we have that out of the way, let's go ahead and start our conversation. First, we're going to turn to Brian. And Brian, I'd love for you to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background and your path to New Jersey, and then kind of give us an overview of the higher education landscape in New Jersey, including some recent exciting developments that I know happened last week. So we'll turn it over to you, Brian, to get us started.
Well, thank you, James. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with everyone today, and it's great to share with you a little bit about my background and how it shapes my vision for higher education in New Jersey. As people can tell from my CV or my LinkedIn page or wherever they may choose to follow me, I've held a wide range of positions in my career in higher education over the past 25 years, including I've been a faculty member, worked in student affairs. I've been an academic as well as a researcher, student mentor at both public and private universities, as well as holding leadership positions at national nonprofit associations like ACE and UNCF. And about 2 weeks ago, I was, as James already noted, I was officially confirmed as New Jersey Secretary of Higher Education. And I couldn't be more honored to leverage my personal and professional experiences to carry forward the state's priorities, enhance collaboration across the state and with other agencies and organizations across the country, and continue to make post-secondary opportunities more equitable and affordable within New Jersey, and serve as a model for the rest of the country. OSHE, our agency, is called the Office of the Secretary of Higher Education, or OSHE for short, is New Jersey's coordinating agency responsible for statewide policy development and coordination of a range of higher education initiatives. And that includes everything from grant administration and research analysis to post-secondary licensure, program approval, and legislative regulatory affairs support. One of the things that I alluded to just now, program approval, that's part of new legislation that was just signed earlier this week as well, that empowers our office to approve programs, branch campuses, and do some physical monitoring of the institutions as well. So OSHE has a robust agenda within the state. And through our state plan for higher education, which was really led by my predecessor, Dr. Zakiya Smith-Ellis, who's now the state's chief policy advisor, we work to advance policies that expand post-secondary opportunities and access and improve completion. New Jersey itself is home to more than 80 institutions that enroll roughly almost 500,000 students each year. And this past year, we worked collaboratively across state government and with our institutional partners to prepare for and respond to the ongoing pandemic. Today itself, we were talking about this earlier because we have a COVID call 3 times a week. Today marks 1 year since New Jersey confirmed its first COVID case. And New Jersey, like New York, was hit hard and early. And early on, we worked closely with our institutional leaders to ensure they were in a state of readiness to respond to the most unprecedented public health crisis that we've had to navigate in our lifetimes. We shifted from preparedness to response. We convened a group of higher education stakeholders, which continues meeting monthly. And we call that group the HERAG, Higher Education Restart Advisory Group. You know, higher ed is always good for an acronym. And that includes institutional presidents, faculty, and students. And their insights informed our reopening guidance. And over the course of the past year, we've all been forced to put on our public health hats, and we've all become more knowledgeable about tests and vaccines. And we've had to ask, how can we as a state ensure student success and vitality for our higher education ecosystem now and into the future? And in order for us to answer that question is to accept the fact that the pandemic's long-term effects will be felt for years to come as we recover and build long-term resilience. And that's why our proposed fiscal year 22 budget includes historic strategic public investments to address Governor Murphy's ambitious goals for higher education in the state and help reverse across the board declines in enrollment and improve affordability at a time when many families are struggling. Our budget includes, the budget that was proposed by the governor includes $50 million for what we're calling the Garden State Guarantee, which would provide 2 years of free tuition at 4-year institutions for students with household incomes below $65,000 a year. That's in addition to an increase of $7 million for a total of $27 million to support our Community College Opportunity Grant, CCOG as we call it, which provides tuition-free community college for eligible students attending community colleges. And we're proud to say that last week, and that's something that we're very excited about, the CCOG program was officially signed into law, and this will offer a tuition-free community college education to more than 2,000. Actually, the program has been in place the last few years and has been funded by annual funding allocations. But this makes it into law now so that students can be assured that this funding will be there to support this program. So taken together, eligible students could receive 4 years of tuition-free college education in New Jersey if they start at a community college and then transfer to a 4-year institution. Also, last week, we announced about $30 million in federal governor's emergency education relief funding that will be directed to our institutions to address the core priorities of our state plan for higher education and address student hunger, which I'll talk more in depth about later. But so all told, in the last week or two, we've announced almost $100 million in new investments, around $96 million in new investments in higher education in New Jersey, which makes this a great place to be. And we're excited to serve as a model for the rest of the country. So I'll turn things back over to you, James.
Very exciting, Brian. Thanks for sharing all those developments. It's very exciting to see those pieces coming into place and how they're going to work together and create a comprehensive structure to support students. And we're looking forward to digging in a little more about the strategic plan and effects on completion later in the conversation. But first, I'd love to now turn over to Antoinette and invite her to give a brief overview of CAP and the post-secondary education team, kind of the role that you all play in the higher education advocacy space. And I know that your team has been tracking the federal stimulus response to the pandemic and how that has actually kind of moved the needle in helping students. So Antoinette, I would love if you could speak for a little bit about those things.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much to the Hunt Institute for having me. My name is Antoinette Flores, and I'm the Managing Director of the Post-Secondary Education Policy Team at the Center for American Progress, or CAP. CAP is a nonpartisan independent policy institute dedicated to improving the lives of all Americans through bold progressive ideas and concerted action. The post-secondary education policy agenda at CAP is built on the belief that high quality and affordable education beyond high school is essential, but in order for that promise to pay off, Americans from all backgrounds must be able to access, afford, and complete high quality degrees. The central areas we focus on are equity, and that includes access, affordability, completion, quality, and accountability. There's increasing evidence that today's system falls far short in equitably providing affordable, high quality opportunities. Students of color and low-income students across the country are disproportionately impacted by systemic failures, and degrees are increasingly unaffordable, which is why I am very glad to hear of the updates in New Jersey. But our work includes research, analysis, and advocacy on policy solutions toward addressing higher education's needs. On today's topic of completion at the federal level, data so far, I think it's far too early to know what the long-term impact of today's pandemic will have on completion, but we know that it's already having a significant impact on enrollment, with enrollment declines across the public higher education system, and particularly at community colleges. There's also some evidence of declines for college applications occurring among low-income students and first-generation college students. And there's also evidence from declines in FAFSA application filing. All of these indicators so far apply mostly to incoming students. And so there's still a lot to be determined on how the pandemic is impacting current students. At the federal level, CAP has been heavily focused on the various relief bills that have been working their way through Congress, proposed and passed. On a positive note, Congress has to date allocated $36 billion for higher education funding for colleges. About $12 billion of that has gone directly to students in the form of emergency grant aid to help cover unexpected expenses. This kind of relief, both for institutions and for students, is to date unprecedented. And I think it will go a long way toward helping institutions which are facing significant challenges provide quality education, and will also go a long way toward keeping students enrolled. There have been a number of other changes that I think help with potentially help with completion that have made their way through Congress. So one is that it allows aid applicants receiving unemployment benefits or their families to be counted as having zero income. That means families that are facing unemployment potentially qualify for Pell Grants during the national emergency. Second, it also allows college students that are enrolled at least half-time and are eligible for federal work study or for the maximum Pell Grant to qualify for emergency federal food assistance. We know that meeting basic needs is important at any time, but it's particularly important now when we're seeing an increased need for food assistance. And there's hope that both of these efforts will contribute to helping with completion and improving completion as students face very significant challenges across the country. So I'm happy to talk more throughout our conversation about efforts at the federal level, but I will turn it back.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, we're looking forward to hearing more about the effects that you and your team have seen of what's happened so far, and areas of opportunity for future rounds of support. So looking forward to talking more about that. But first, I want to turn things over to Tim and have him introduce himself. And Tim, I'd love if you could talk about how Georgia State really redesigned a lot of its institutional policies in an effort to support students in better and more comprehensive ways. I wonder if you could give us a high-level overview of those efforts and the effects that they have had on student completion. And then later on in the conversation, we're going to ask you to talk about the pandemic response. But first, I'd love for you to just give kind of a brief overview of the GSU student success story.
Sure. Thanks, James, and thanks to everybody for being here. I think my role on today's panel is to represent the institutional perspective and how things look kind of on the ground. And, you know, Georgia State is a very appropriate test case for a lot of the strains and struggles that are going on during the pandemic, but even prior to it. Georgia State is one of the largest MSIs in the country, minority serving institutions. We enroll about 54,000 students, 75% of whom are non-white, 60% of whom are low income. As recently as 15 years ago, we were failing. I mean, I think that's the only way to put it. Overall, our graduation rates hovered around 30%. What happened in the interim 15 years on a demographic perspective would not immediately suggest that Georgia State would be the site of a turnaround in student success, because we basically over the last 15 years, we've doubled our non-white enrollments, and we've doubled our low-income enrollments at Georgia State. We've also had SAT scores for incoming freshmen drop by about 33 points over the same period. So, you know, the usual pundits would say that's a formula for disaster, right? A low graduation rate, and increased diversity from a demographic perspective, and lower admission standards for the incoming students. But what's happened at Georgia State over the last 15 years is not only have we exponentially increased graduation rates, so they have not gone up incrementally for many of our populations, including both our Black, our Latin, and our Latinx students. We've more than doubled the graduation rates. In some cases, we're getting close to tripling the graduation rates for these students. But we've been able to eliminate equity gaps, at least those based on race, ethnicity, and income level. We've had 6 years in a row where our Black, our Latinx, and our Pell students have graduated at or above the rate of the student body overall. I'm happy to say COVID did not interrupt that streak, that this year's numbers will continue that streak. We're graduating 3,500 more students every year than we were just 10 years ago. And we now confer more bachelor's degrees to African-American students than any other college or university in the US. No small achievement for a campus that was segregated whites only as recently as the 1960s. All the more ironic because I'm sitting here about 4 blocks away from Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the Reverend King was, Martin Luther King was head pastor. So how have we done it? We're going to talk a little bit about it, but it's basically been through scaled support systems for students, in many cases leveraging data and technology. So we had a huge problem with students who were close to graduating, dropping out right before they did so because they were running out of eligibility for their financial aid. And we introduced a microgrant program based upon data to put the money in the students' pockets without them having to fill out any application. We just identify students close to graduating who have run out of eligibility, and we reach out with institutional aid. We were having huge challenges with summer melt. Students in the period before they enroll at Georgia State, not even making it to the first day of classes because they got overwhelmed by the bureaucracy, the FAFSA, the verification process, the transcripts, the immunization records, and all these other sorts of things. So we launched an AI chatbot, an automatic texting platform that allowed students to ask questions 24/7. The first 3 months we had it active, we had 180,000 questions answered for our incoming first-year students. And we've been able to greatly reduce summer melt. We were losing 5,700 students a year to just stop out, right? They were enrolled one semester, not the next. And so now we're tracking students every day for 800 different data-based risk factors, factors that the historical data show precipitated students' likelihood to drop out or flunk out of Georgia State. And we're reaching out with proactive intervention. So if a student struggles in a quiz, we're not sitting back. We're getting them help literally within 24 or 48 hours. If they're not logging on to their online classes, we're reaching out. So it's been those kind of systematic approaches that Georgia State has used to deliver personalized attention to students on a day-to-day basis. And what we found is, even though the academic preparation of our students haven't changed, our own complicity in the student dropout rates has been revealed. And by doing a better job of getting information to students and supporting them, in many cases, just to help them navigate our bureaucracy, we've seen transformative changes in our own graduation rates.
Thanks, Tim. It's such an inspiring story to hear, and we are looking forward to hearing more about how those systems enabled you to pivot quickly and continue supporting students in the wake of the pandemic. I'm gonna now start asking a few questions of our panelists, but we do hope that you have your questions being formulated as well. As a reminder, please use the Q&A feature via Zoom or Twitter to submit your questions, and thanks to those who submitted questions beforehand. But for my first question, I'd like to go back to Brian and ask you to kind of expand on something you mentioned in your opening remarks, which is the state strategic plan for higher education, where opportunity meets innovation. And I know that support for on-time college completion is a fundamental part of that plan. It's established as a right for higher education students in New Jersey. And so I wonder if you can talk from a state policymaker perspective about the importance of prioritizing on-time completion within kind of your strategic thinking, and also how has the pandemic shifted your strategic approach to supporting on-time completion?
So thank you for that question, James. You know, as I think about the question and as we think about how we work to build a skilled workforce, I think that we live in an era today where people are concerned with the utility of their degrees. So creating a skilled workforce is critically important these days. And as we also work to retain students in New Jersey and match their talent to the needs of industry in the state, we're focused on increasing our educational attainment goal of 65 by 25. We're working to get 65% of working age adults to obtain a high quality credential by 2025. The only way we can do that is to acknowledge the fact that higher education remains unattainable for far too many students. New Jersey's attainment rate is currently 57%, which is actually pretty good because it exceeds the national average of 51%, and that's all post-secondary credential and degrees. But students of color are attaining at rates not even close to that. And so Hispanic attainment in the state is 27%, American Indian attainment is 31%, African American attainment is 34%. And we believe that one of the ways to address that is through on-time completion, because it has a multiplier effect, if you will, that you can, one, more quickly get students into the workforce if they complete degrees more quickly, which helps the student themselves, helps their families, and helps the state economy. On-time completion also can help improve those racial attainment numbers that I just mentioned. And it helps the state to improve the quality of life for first-generation students who earn a degree and break intergenerational cycles of poverty. It provides there are benefits to the state financially. You get more students earning rather than paying tuition dollars. So on-time completion is a win-win all across the board. And your question about COVID, we know that COVID has exacerbated the inequities that existed among minority and underserved communities prior to the pandemic, which is causing us to creatively rethink strategies to achieve our goals. But we still have one primary commitment, and that's ensure that every resident, regardless of life circumstances, has the opportunity to obtain a high quality credential that prepares them for life after college. And we're working hard to ensure that students have the supports they need to complete their degree or credential and take their success to new heights. And we're really concerned about being very persistent about that, because we worry about possibly losing a generation of students. And I know that other organizations and sectors in the higher education landscape are concerned about that as well, particularly the students who, as I mentioned, were already most vulnerable prior to the pandemic. And that is why, as I mentioned previously, we're purposely dedicating federal funding to advance the goals of our state plan, which include expanding opportunities for students to gain early college exposure, improving college affordability, and cultivating research, innovation, and talent. A piece of that, as I mentioned, we're dedicating almost $30 million of gear funding to this. $1 million of that is going to work with campuses that are designated as hunger-free campuses. To Antoinette's point earlier about being concerned about food insecurities for students. I believe that our focus is to try to make sure that all of the barriers that prevent student success, we know that they're multifaceted, interconnected, and require sustainable solutions. And this is why we're trying to be as strategic as possible to leverage all of the funding opportunities we have available to us to help institutions develop system-wide reforms that pave the way for long-term progress in achieving our goals. So hopefully that answered your question, James, and look forward to further discussion about this.
Very much. Not only answered my question, but provided a wonderful segue into the next question that I was hoping to ask Antoinette about leveraging some of those federal resources. But it's great to hear that you're taking kind of an all hands on deck approach there in New Jersey to support students. So Antoinette, you mentioned kind of a high level overview of the federal stimulus funding and what has made its way towards higher education institutions and students thus far. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the effectiveness of the federal efforts to date in meeting the scope of need that's been revealed and exacerbated. And then kind of as a follow-up, I would love for you to say a few words about what additional steps you think Congress or the federal government should be taking at this time to support students.
Yeah, so I would take a step back for a second to talk about the significant challenges, financial challenges in particular, that are facing institutions across the country. Institutions are facing additional costs in the form of health and safety protocols to keep students and faculty safe if they are open, and that includes offering courses in an online environment, both of which can be significant costs, not to mention losses in revenue from declining enrollment or on-campus revenue, in addition to state funding cuts. By our count, just over 20 states have cut some form of higher education funding in the past year. And given the economic uncertainty around state budgets, it's potential that those cuts could become a lot worse over the course of the next year. This is not surprising. This is something that we saw following the Great Recession. There were significant cuts to higher education in the years following, and that is funding that is never fully recovered. Cuts have a big impact on institutions. That could mean declines in faculty, reducing faculty or programs, potentially student support, and down the line, increases in tuition or decreases in aid going to students. While these are not direct indicators of quality, they certainly add up and can have an impact on access and completion. All of that to say that while the funding that has been provided so far from Congress is significant, much needed, and well-timed, it's not enough. It's just beginning to plug the holes, and especially as we consider the prospect of states potentially needing to cut back on funding for higher education, there's a need for more. It falls far short of what institutions project that they will need over the long term. And it's important to remember that, this pandemic, even when the national emergency ends, we're going to see the impacts for a long period of time. It's not just going to go away. So the second COVID relief package did not have additional funding for state and local governments. It looks like the package that is being considered by Congress today will, but without additional funding to help states plug some of their budget holes, it makes the prospect of state cuts more likely. But there have also been some implementation challenges on the side of the Department of Education in providing funding, particularly as it relates to the CARES Act, which was the first round of relief. There was some conflicting guidance to colleges over student eligibility. So the first round of guidance that went out to institutions said it's up to the institution's discretion to decide how to distribute student aid. There was following guidance after some institutions had already started distributing aid that said students must meet Title IV eligibility requirements. In order to do that as an institution, you need to have a FAFSA on file. And that impacts in particular undocumented students and international students, but also community college students who may not file a FAFSA and student veterans, among others. The guidance has gone back and forth, but for the most part, during that first round of relief, institutions were limited to relying on who had a FAFSA on file. And if you want to get aid out quickly to students that really need it, that requires discretion on behalf of the institution. On the bright side, I would say between the first relief package and the second relief package, Congress helped better target funding. So under the CARES Act, the formula that is used to distribute funding relied on what is called a full-time equivalent enrollment, which, if you're not familiar with the term, it's basically a measure that converts part-time students to fractions of full-time attendees. This disadvantaged community colleges who serve large numbers of part-time students, and overall, when you look at the distribution of funds in that first round, community colleges who enroll about 40% of the student population only received about 28% of the funds. And that's a challenge when you have institutions that are already underfunded and experiencing enrollment declines. Through the second round of relief, Congress instead decided to split the distribution based on total enrollment and full-time equivalent enrollment, and that ended up, under that formula, community colleges ended up getting a much more equitable share, much closer to 40% of the distribution. That means more funding to institutions that are already underfunded and do a lion's share of the work providing access. So that's on, what we've seen so far at the federal level. As far as what improvements are needed in the future, we need a long-term solution to this boom and bust cycle of recessions that impact state budgets and end up with cuts to higher education. We also need a long-term investment in college affordability without significant debt. This is something that the Biden administration is proposing addressing through offering free community college, free college at four-year institutions for families earning under $125,000, and doubling the Pell Grant. And these kinds of improvements over the long term are critical because we know that cost is a barrier both to access and completion. But we also need to work on closing funding and resource gaps across institutions to ensure that institutions have what they need to get students across the finish line. That means additional investments to community colleges, MSIs, and HBCUs. So CAP released a report last year that showed that community colleges across the country received $78 billion less in revenue. That adds up to about $8,000 less per student to spend on education, despite playing a very vital role in providing access. It would be great as Congress considers addressing additional investments in affordability that we focus on these resource gaps. The other thing I would say is one of the things that I'm worried about is a focus on quality. So you've had thousands of institutions across the country switch overnight to online education, which is not necessarily what a lot of students expected they were applying for. And I can see a universe where some institutions decide they want to maintain some of their programs online. But in order to do that, we definitely need better quality oversight to ensure that it isn't negatively impacting retention and completion. Finally, Congress has made a really big investment here over the last year in emergency student grant aid, which is not something that has previously happened, and that is making a big difference in students' lives across the country. So I think as we go forward, it's important to consider some longer term solution because students face crises every day that lead them to not complete.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Antoinette. Really great takeaways there. Plenty to chew on. I feel like I could ask you 5 follow-up questions and we could spend the rest of the time talking about that. And thanks as well. Michelle from Learning Heroes had sent in a question about the financial challenges faced by institutions. So thanks for anticipating and answering Michelle's question as well. Before we kind of open things up a little more, Tim, I would love to ask you an opening question that I kind of already alluded to, which is I'd love for you to talk about the experience at GSU when the pandemic hit and you were forced to pivot and adapt to campus closures. Please talk a little bit about how the systems that you had put in place enabled you to minimize the disruptions, and what are some kind of takeaways you're thinking in terms of how that might affect how GSU interacts with its students going forward.
Yeah, I can be both optimistic and pessimistic here, and I'm going to be both. I'm going to start with the optimism that, in some ways, Georgia State, without knowing it, has been designing for a pandemic for the past decade, because our student body is stressed on a day-to-day basis. 80% of our students, undergraduates, have jobs. Many of them have family commitments and families that they're responsible for. We had been designing supports that didn't require students to interact in a physical and so-called traditional fashion. So we had been using and advising predictive analytics to identify when a student is struggling, rather than waiting for a student to self-diagnose and come and see us. We had been using the proactive Panther Retention Grant program to identify students who have financial distress, and again, not require them to come into an office, but instead proactively put the money in their account. We had been using a chatbot to communicate with students and provide hundreds of thousands of answers on a monthly basis to students. And I will say that all of those investments paid off over the last 12 months. When we pivoted to online classes at the end of March last year, we immediately added some new alerts to our advising tracking so that we could determine on a day-to-day basis whether students were logging on to their online classes and the intensity during which they were logging on. So that in many cases, within a day of a student not logging on, somebody was reaching out and saying, what's going on? Is it academic? Is it financial? Is it emotional? Is it technical? How can we help? We've had over 30,000 of proactive interactions with students since the beginning of the pandemic, just by tracking whether they were logging on to their classes and doing so with the right extent and intensity. When we got our CARES Act money at the very beginning of April, we were within 24 hours able to distribute just under 20,000 grants to students. We had set up an emergency application process, and that still exists. Students can apply for emergency aid, but that requires the students to have the bandwidth to know about the process, fill out an application, and then wait for a resolution. We, having run the Panther Retention Grant program for almost a decade now, and having distributed 19,000 grants based upon a data analysis of which students were financially distressed, didn't feel that we were restricted to only waiting for students to apply for grants. We knew which students had high levels of unmet need. We knew which students had unpaid balances for the semester. We knew which students had holds on their accounts for financial reasons, and we went out and resolved those issues. Since the pandemic has begun, we've given about 3,000 grants based upon students filling out an application. We've now given over 30,000 grants based upon us identifying problems that the students were facing and just proactively putting the money in the students' accounts. So, these sorts of things, the chatbot, incredibly helpful. We were under stress to get students who were in university housing to move out, knowing that many of our students had no place to go. So when the governor told us to clear out housing, and we knew we're not going to clear out housing because many of our students didn't have a place to go, we needed to get information quickly from them. We did two things. We sent an email to the students in housing. After 24 hours, about 14% of the students had opened that email. At the same time, we sent a text via the chatbot to students asking, do you have some place safe that you're going, or do you need to stay with us? And within 10 minutes, we heard back from 2,000 students with their actual responses. So that's the optimism. The pessimism, and I'm going to build upon Antoinette here, is I see problems brewing. One of them is SAP, and this was not an issue that Antoinette mentioned, but the satisfactory academic progress depends upon students' GPA and their accumulation of credit hours at a certain rate. The 1 semester or 2 semesters into the pandemic, we're not going to see students en masse falling out of compliance with SAP. But as we complete this spring semester, that's going to be a bigger and bigger issue. The guidelines we've been given by the federal government so far say we can be more lenient in petitions for SAP if a student falls out of compliance. But I think we need to think about larger scale solutions, because we're going to have literally hundreds of thousands of additional students who are facing problems with their eligibility for federal financial aid. The other one is learning loss. And in some ways, we've faced the better case scenario so far, because the new students who came in last fall had gotten through a good part of their senior year of high school still with their traditional educational systems in place. The students coming in this fall will have just gone through really 16 months of online learning. And Georgia State largely serves Metro Atlanta schools and most prominent Atlanta public schools. A lot of these systems has really struggled. So I think Antoinette is exactly right that we are going to face these kind of challenges for a number of years after even the kind of physical signs of the pandemic may be lifting. We're going to still have students coming in struggling. We're going to have to get through. We're coming up with a program right now for our summer to catch our current first-year students who dropped or withdrew from more classes than has traditionally been the case to be able to catch up this summer so they get back on track. But we're going to face probably an even deeper problem with the students who are first enrolling this fall.
Thanks, Tim. And the pessimism is helpful with some runway so that people can start thinking about and preparing for some of these issues like SAP compliance. So thank you for sharing those thoughts. We have a great number of questions. I do apologize in advance because I do not think that we will be able to get to all of them. I'm going to start with a combination of some questions that I would love for Brian and Antoinette to respond to, and then we have a couple of questions specific to Tim, so I'll hold those for Tim. But Brian and Antoinette, we have a couple of people who are asking about how to meet the specific completion needs of different student populations. And I think they reference kind of the intersectionality of need that is out there. We had a question about parenting students who might need to juggle access to childcare with their coursework. Another question about Indigenous and Native students. And a third question about students who age out of the foster care system and then have to navigate a pathway into higher education. So as you think about all the different specific needs that are out there and the ways that each individual might be facing a different number of these needs, how can you think about creating supports to provide kind of a suite of options that can meet some needs of these different student populations? Brian, we'll go to you first.
Sure, thank you, James. Well, I want to say I think we need to start with getting the data and the information so we can know how to and where to direct our resources and our targeted interventions. And Tim and the folks at Georgia State are the perfect example of that. I know that they built their transformation around the intentional, strategic, and innovative use of data and analysis of data, and not just the standard analyses by race and gender and the like, but digging deeper into those kind of micro analyses that tell you things that you don't know on its face, or that might be counterintuitive, and then identify the pain points and have the will. And I think that's where we often fall short. We have to have the will. Once we get the data and know who needs help, what kind of help they need, when do they need it, where do they need it, we then have to have the will to actually do something about it. And I think, as Antoinette alluded to, Congress has been generous in their support during this pandemic over the past year. But we know that the students who have been most negatively impacted are the ones that people are asking questions about. These were students who were already marginalized before the pandemic. So I think and one of the things I'm committed to in New Jersey, and our team at OSHE is committed to, is collecting the data that helps us identify, from the OSHE perspective as well as the institutional perspective, where are the pain points and how do we intervene? And I think that the investments that we've made in our Hunger Free Campus initiative, as well as what we're calling our Opportunity Meets Innovation Challenge grants, and the other supports that we provided institutions, and helping to make college more affordable through the Community College Opportunity Grant and the Garden State Guarantee investments, I think helped to get us there. But we know that there are more needs out there, and we just need to collect the data to find out what the needs are. Antoinette.
That was a really great response, and I agree with it. I don't necessarily have much more to add, but I think the issue of student parents is really important, because this is a challenge that we're seeing across the country, as women having to drop out of the workforce because of a lack of childcare. And we also are seeing declines in enrollment at the community college level, which we know community colleges serve a large share of student parents. As I mentioned, the kind of support that Congress is providing right now that is generous and provides institutions flexibility to meet students' needs is really important now, but it's also important over the long term.
Thank you both. Very helpful responses. Brian, did you want to add?
Yeah, if I could follow up on that. So once again, I want to, people say you shouldn't toot your own horn, but I will here in New Jersey, because it's, we've got a progressive governor. Governor Murphy has also, as part of his, and I was reminded by this when Antoinette talked about student parents, because that's a commitment to the First Lady of New Jersey, is to help provide more supports for maternal care and the like. And so the state of New Jersey is making investments in those areas as well. And we're working as part of that task force with the First Lady. So I think that you're very right. There's so many needs, particularly for those populations like student parents, and they often go unmet or unheard or unknown. And so I think that we're trying to be as intentional as possible about trying to address as many of those.
Thanks, Brian. That's very helpful context. So Tim, a couple of questions for you. These come from Chanel Watson from the Howard Hines Foundation, as well as Robin Ellis from the Crimson Bridge Foundation. Kind of a two-parter. The first part is for similar institutional leaders who want to try and address the sort of institution-wide transformation that you've talked about, what advice would you give them in terms of how can they get that process started? And then the second part is whether there are particular partners or stakeholders that allowed GSU to make some of these reforms sustainable and long-term.
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, Georgia State's noted for our use of technology and data, and Brian is right that we really drill down at the individual student level, and that often gets the attention, the chatbots, the predictive analytics. I will say that on a day-to-day basis, much more of my time is dedicated to culture change than the acquisition of new technology or new data. How do you get a big campus like Georgia State, 50,000 students, that's wallowing with low graduation rates and a lot of pretty deep pessimism among faculty and staff to move? I think we took a couple steps. I can't say that we knew these would work in advance, but in retrospect, they did. One is, we've always focused at Georgia State at our own complicity in the student dropout rate. I mean, it doesn't do any good for us to sit there and lament about the fact that Atlanta public schools could be stronger or the state could give us more money, because we don't have a direct impact upon those things. So we've looked at our own processes, but we intentionally started, when we asked the question, are we the problem, with the micro level of that question. Are we the problem, meaning are we the administration the problem? So we didn't start initially by saying, faculty need to change everything they're doing or redo the way they teach their classes and so forth. We recognize that the way we admit students, the way we communicate with them, the way we register them, the way we advise them, the way we package them for financial aid is a huge part of the problem. And I think that was useful in diminishing the kind of tension that might exist when you try to get this culture change to go about. I think the data has been critical. There's not much that unites the faculty at a very, very broad university like Georgia State, but most of the faculty do respect the evidence. So we've led with the evidence. And I think probably the other thing we've done is been very intentional about, from the beginning when we launch a program, of tracking the results, doing a true evaluation. The first semester we were using a chatbot, we hired an independent evaluator, Lindsay Page at the University of Pittsburgh, to do a third-party evaluation of the impact. She not only showed the impact, she showed that it disproportionately benefited students from underserved backgrounds. But that's really helpful because it gets the faculty, especially the faculty, but faculty and staff, to begin to believe that the things we do can make a difference. And over time, it was in part igniting that spark again. You know, a lot of us go to higher ed because we want to make a difference, and then big universities like Georgia State do a great job of deadening any kind of enthusiasm we have. You know, we try to do something and there are rules and red tape and policies that prevent us. But we've been able to create the dynamic where faculty and others now begin to come forward and say, I think I can make a difference too. As far as partners are concerned, I'll say the most important part of our strategy is not to be complacent. That we were the first, one of the first partners nationally with EAB, which is a big advising analytics firm. We were the very first partner with AdmitHub, which is the company we're using for our chatbot. We're the first partner with another new technology. We're working with a company called Stepping Blocks that scrapes the internet to find our alums and allow us to present our current students by major with data about what is a current political science major from Georgia State doing, what kind of companies are hiring them, what are their salary levels and so forth. So we've been very willing to partner with things that have yet to been proven and tested. And so many of my counterparts at other universities are extremely cautious. I can't do anything until it's been tried and tested multiple times over. The advantage about having these tech partners early on is that you often get the technology for less cost and you have a larger influence in shaping the nature of the technology. So we have lots of important partners out there, but that's one that immediately comes to mind.
Thanks, Tim. It's so great to have GSU out there as a proof point for the benefits of taking risks and being innovative. We appreciate that perspective. In the remaining 7 minutes, I would like to ask each of our panelists to provide a brief response to a closing question. We're going to start with Brian. Brian, I know you have another engagement right at noon, and we hope to wrap up before then, but I want to give you time. So we'll go Brian, and then Antoinette, and then Tim. And the question is alluding to something, I believe it was Antoinette who mentioned this earlier, that we have some initial clues in terms of FAFSA completion and enrollment numbers about how the pandemic might have affected completion for students over the last year or so. As we get a clearer picture, what specific data points are you looking at to get an understanding of the pandemic's effect, and how might you leverage those data points to guide policy responses? Brian, over to you first.
I want to make sure I'm not on mute. Okay. Thank you for the question, James. I think that, which is a great question. Too often, useful data is collected for some compliance purpose and ends up sitting on a shelf. And that's an old model that should be unacceptable today when we have data that can inform solutions, create greater outcomes, and facilitate increased equity. My vision for OSHE, for the Office of the Secretary of Higher Education, is to employ data in dynamic ways, taking a nod from the folks at Georgia State to guide policymaking and that help us identify previously unrecognized needs. And I think that's the key, previously unrecognized needs, and that provides information that allows us to do something about those needs. We want to dive more deeply into disaggregating the data that we have on the impact of COVID across various populations. And as I mentioned before, not simply by the traditional measures that we use, but to explore impacts at a more micro level. And what are those micro kind of analyses that provide a more nuanced picture of the long-term after effects of the pandemic? So I know you asked about which data points we're looking at. We're still in the midst of figuring that out. I know we want to look at things like, since we know that low-income students have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, we definitely want to look at those categories. But that might be the umbrella category, and what are the particular nuances within low-income populations within certain cities, particularly in New Jersey, or students from low-income populations who intersect with some other data point what are those particular data points that help us to make sure that we understand all the issues that are involved. And that's the only way we will be able to stave off losing a swath of students who tend to be most disproportionately and negatively affected anyway. And so we have to collect this data that allows us to then develop policies, practices, and approaches that help to address them and have the will to do so. So that's a quick nutshell, quick answer in a nutshell. I'm not sure that I fully answered your question, but we're in the process of figuring out what are the numerous data points. And I think we're open to making that kind of taking a living approach to that and finding new data points down the road that will tell us more about what the needs are of the students who've been affected by COVID.
Thanks, Brian. That was an excellent answer to the question. Antoinette, would love for you to respond and talk about briefly, maybe in a minute or so, what data points you're looking out for and why you think they might be most relevant.
Yeah, I will be very brief. I think it's really important that overall we're looking at withdrawal and retention rates disaggregated by subpopulations to evaluate the impact that it's had. We know that once students take a leave of absence or withdraw for any reason, they're much more likely to return. But I'm also interested in seeing the data based on students that had to go online versus those that were able to stay in person. I mentioned I have quality concerns about online generally, and the switch that had to happen rather quickly without the type of planning that would typically go into that. And so would like to see more data around that.
Great, thanks, Antoinette. Tim, same question over to you for a brief closing response.
Yeah, and I can provide some data to Antoinette. So we've been tracking our students very closely over the last 12 plus months. What we've found is interesting. We haven't seen huge differences in academic performance, drop and withdrawal rates, and so forth based upon race, ethnicity. We have seen huge differences based on class standing. So the bottom line is our juniors and seniors have done a little better than they have in the past. Their GPA is up. We conferred as many degrees. In fact, we set new records end of spring, summer, and fall for the number of degrees we've conferred at Georgia State. Those students who have already, in a sense, learned to do college seem to be progressing fine. Where we saw problems, and they evidenced very clearly in drop and withdrawal rates this fall, were with our first-year students. These are students, mostly at Georgia State, as you now know, minority students and first-generation students who come from low-income backgrounds who have not figured out how to do college. And to throw at them a roster of online classes, did not work as well as we would like. We're retooling. I mentioned that one of the things we have planned this summer, and we're going to use some of the stimulus money to incentivize students to participate in this program, is to get some of those students who drop and withdrew but are still with us to take the courses they need so they'll be back on track by the time fall semester begins again. So that's why I'm particularly concerned about the incoming students this fall, because if the classes are not going to be taught in a better fashion, and they're coming from maybe even a weaker preparation stage because they've gone through a lot of COVID during their last part of high school, I think we're going to be facing this kind of learning gap for a number of years to come.
Thanks, Tim. That is fascinating and makes me want to continue this conversation for an additional hour, but we are at time, and I know that Brian in particular has to jump. We so appreciate Brian, Antoinette, and Tim sharing their insight with us today. We so appreciate you all joining us for the conversation, and we hope that it was valuable. A couple of very brief ending housekeeping notes. I want to let you know about some upcoming webinar opportunities. Next week, we have a Homeroom with Education Leaders webinar on entrepreneurship and education. The week after that is the latest in our Race and Education series on educators of color and the water they carry. And then a week after that is our Governing Principles series on recruiting, developing, and retaining the early childhood workforce. And we hope that you will follow us on Twitter and check out our website for additional opportunities. Thanks again for the panelists and all of our attendees for joining us today for this terrific conversation. We so appreciate your time, and we hope to see you again at a Hunt Institute event sometime soon. Thanks all.